for authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs. Listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me today is going to be Joseph Atwill, and he's the author of Caesar's Messiah. And we're going to be talking about his book today. He has some information about it he'd like to share and see what you folks think. And if y'all want to learn more about him, his website's www.caesarsmessiah.com. Feel free to pay him a visit, and he'll have other links to other interesting information as well. And if y'all want to call in and ask questions, the number is 832-632-7904. And before we get started, I always like to remind everybody that Talk Now Radio is listener-supported radio. With y'all's help, I don't have to, worry about having sponsors fund me that may or may cancel out the first time I have a topic that they don't like. I can pretty well guarantee folks out there tonight that if I was being sponsored by, say, Chick-fil-A, the Tonight Show would probably not go aired because of funding. Because I think everybody knows that they're Christians, and anybody that says anything different than the Bible about the Messiah is liable to have problems from any Christian source of funding. So when you guys, do the donation meter, click on the affiliate links and things of that nature, you're basically helping me stay listening supported and keep the information coming to you that otherwise may not get to you. So how are you doing today, Joseph?
Just fine, Royce. Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the air. And I got to tell you, I've really been blessed this week because I got you lined up for today on Caesar's Messiah. And I got Jay Gallus lined up tomorrow over at Revolution Radio for Pico Christ. So I'm getting to do two really good subjects. Well, your subjects are actually very close, but not exactly the same in a 2-day time span, so I feel lucky. So why don't you tell us a little something just to break the ice with the listeners about what got you interested in Caesar's Messiah?
Sure. Well, I had studied the Gospels when I was a young boy. I grew up in Japan. I attended a Jesuit, what was called a military academy. I'm not sure why they called it that, but it was a school that studied the Gospels essentially every day. It was a boarding school, and we would just pay attention to the Gospels and try to understand it as best we could. But later in life, I sort of just fell away from the faith. I didn't have any negative experiences. I just sort of got into other things, and it just wasn't something, Christianity just wasn't something that was that important to me at a certain point. And but I always was very curious about the character Jesus for some reason. And I think probably somewhere in college, I started to become interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what really interested me and what really kind of set me to broaden my research and to have it be in a more focused nature was the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls described a messianic movement. It was a group that basically looked to a Christ or Messiah and had basically the same proof texts. In other words, they looked at the same scripture passages that the authors of the Gospels used in relationship to prefiguration of Jesus. But this group looked to a different individual. This group was militaristic. And the literature was clearly part of the literature that propelled the Jews to rebel and had the Great War with Rome between 66 and 73 CE. So it was curious to me how, in the Gospels you would have kind of a quasi-pacifist character, Messiah. At the same time, another Messianic organization was in Judea that was completely militaristic. So just studying the two organizations side by side, it just made no sense to me how they could have coexisted. And I just began then to try to understand the Gospels in a different way. And I started reading writers and scholars that had alternative explanations. For example, Robert Eisenman, he wrote a book called James, the Brother of Jesus, and he was very much linking the Gospels into the war. He was showing all of these kinds of connections between the story of Jesus and this war. This then, in general, led me back to start just beginning to study the Gospels in a very focused way, and particularly in their relationship to the war. And so in order to study the war, and in fact to study the history of Judea at all, you have to read a historian called Flavius Josephus. Josephus is just the only extant historian that we have. There's just nobody else that left any material about Judea in the first century who was on the ground. So I started studying him, and while doing that, I saw that there were strange connections and relationships between the war that Josephus was describing and the stories that were appearing in the Gospels. And then over time, I just developed an understanding that the story of Jesus was fiction, and it had been created by the Romans after the war. And what they did with the character was they created Jesus as a character of prefiguration, which I know is kind of a fancy word, and I'm not sure if everyone in your audience will kind of immediately understand it. But just in general, prefiguration is a life of one character foresees events in the life of a subsequent character, so that you have events from Moses or Elijah or different characters in the Old Testament that the authors of the story of Jesus then reuse and have these rough sort of parallelisms between these stories in the past and the stories they're writing. And the purpose of the prefiguration is to show that there's kind of a divine pattern that God is essentially bringing about the life of these prophets, because these parallel events show that they're not ordinary men.
Kind of like the similarities between Jesus and Joseph.
Yeah, the similarities between Jesus and just the Old Testament prophets in general. Just as an example, at the beginning of the ministry, he's baptized by John the Baptist. Well, if you take all of the elements of the baptism stories, you can essentially determine where every single concept came from. The location, the clothing that John the Baptist is wearing, the act of baptism, everything comes from primarily Malachi, from other stories. And the authors then developed them into a new story to show that John the Baptist and Jesus had been prefigured. In other words, they were showing that the Old Testament religion, the Hebraic Bible and the chain of prophets that God had created, was extended to this character, Jesus Christ, so that you basically have the imprimatur, the religious authority of the prior prophets that now has been focused into the life of the one that the authors are writing about. Now, they did this. The reason why the Romans did this is because, and it's, if you study the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can see what was driving them. The Jews of the era that rebelled were very focused unto prefiguration. They were looking for patterns in their literature, trying to see when the Messiah would come that would help them rebel against Rome. And so this was part of what was causing the rebellion. And so with the Gospels, they took those same prophecies about a coming Messiah or Christ, and they showed that, look, they foresaw a character that wasn't militaristic, that didn't advocate rebellion against the empire. In fact, was a kind of a pacifist, someone who was pro-Roman, someone who could get along inside the Roman Empire. So the Gospels had this political purpose of just trying to change the direction of the interpretation that was being done, so that the populations would look to the religion, look to Judaism to produce a pacifistic Christ.
Okay. Now, was any of the Old Testament scripture altered to serve this purpose?
No, not that I'm aware of. There are some people that have the theory, particularly regarding Daniel, but we just don't have enough data points. You know, we don't really have an uninterrupted compendium of Hebraic Bibles going back to, the Torah and then coming forward into the first century. So, with the scrolls, which is really what we have, the best material, you have all kinds of different, versions of Daniel. They have a lot of it that's quite parallel to the version of, the Old Testament that we have, but other passages are quite different, and they even have a few books that aren't found in the Hebraic Bible at all. So, there's really no way to know what exactly was altered and what was not.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you mentioned the use of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Did this include the Copper Scrolls?
Well, the Copper Scroll actually is not an interpretation of Scripture. It's a treasure map. So it really isn't something that gave me an understanding of how the literature of the Gospels was assembled, what was the genre that they were creating. The Copper Scroll is just very interesting. It's impossible to date. I've written papers. In fact, I wrote a paper with Robert Eisenman called Redating the Dating, where we analyzed the carbon-14 techniques that had been used with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we pointed out various criticisms of the techniques that had been done. We didn't like really how they were using C14 dating with the scrolls, but the Copper Scroll is copper, so you don't really know when it was actually created. There's no way to know. So it's really, and of course it doesn't do analysis of the of the Gospels, or excuse me, of the Hebrew Bible. It doesn't use the Hebrew literature as a basis for what it's describing. It's really important because the Copper Scroll, in my opinion, I place it into the first century. That's when I suspect it was created, and it was just describing how they had to hide the treasure from the Romans. So this, kind of gives you an understanding of how then the scrolls were hidden, because you can see how meticulous they were in hiding their physical treasure, but they would have been just as meticulous in hiding their literature. And so, 2,000 years later, the Dead Sea Scrolls are found in caves, which I think had been sealed over, and had essentially come to life through, the erosion and whatnot. But they were actually buried in the ground, typically, in caves. So they were very, very carefully hidden. And the reason they did that is, in my opinion, because the Romans were trying to destroy their literature. They wanted to get rid of the revolutionary prophetic material. They wanted to get rid of the literature that described a violent, militaristic, xenophobic Christ, and then have only their version of messianic interpretation available for the public. So they just wanted to wipe out the material that was propelling rebellion, so that the only thing that anyone could read about would have been the pacifistic Jesus character.
Kind of like following the theory, if you don't want somebody to drive the car, take away the keys.
Yeah, that's kind of, the Romans were just very practical. The empire was a prison of nations. They were, locking up ethnicities and religions, and they had to have very developed techniques in order to maintain control because they were in such a minority.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned before that what you had noticed between and I want to say it was the wars of the Jews in the New Testament was correlations of who was it, Flavius Tacitus battles?
Yeah, and in other words, Jesus describes a character called the Son of Man, and some of the times he's certainly when he uses the title, and it's just a title, he's clearly talking about himself. But other times he talks about what's referred to as the second coming. He's talking about the Son of Man in the third person, and he's going to come. And he actually describes events from the war that will occur, be associated with the coming of this Son of Man that he's envisioning in the future. For example, he says that he predicts that the temple's complex, all these buildings and the Jewish temple, the Jerusalem temple, will be raised, not one stone atop another. He says that the city will be encircled with a wall. Jerusalem will be encircled with a wall. And so he is actually predicting military victories that the Flavians achieved. So this, these events I could see, and everyone sees inside the gospel. But then in reading it carefully, I noticed that there were what could be called typology. There was essentially a reason, just to give an example of why it's at the Sea of Galilee Jesus develops his disciples, and why he says, "If you follow me, you'll become fishers of men." The location and the point in the narrative of his story that this occurs. I mean, no one really notices those things. They just read the literature and, it just sort of there's this presumption that it's an honest history. But the fact is that that episode is a typologic scene. It's actually developed from an event at the war where, this Roman Caesar, came to this location and, his troops followed him, and then they went out and fished for men, of course, not in the spiritual sense, but in the literal sense. And so, what I could see was that the Romans had put into the Gospels this kind of veiled typology that showed that Jesus actually, his whole ministry was predicting the coming of the Son of Man who was going to come during the war. So this was, it's a genre of Hebrew literature. It may seem kind of hocus pocus, but actually this method of typology is pretty well known to scholars and, particularly to those that study Hebraic literature. And, when I went through it, I could see it was very clear that, there were, and the reason why it was so clear is that the great majority of the events that make up the connection between Jesus and the Caesar, who is the Son of Man that Jesus predicts, occur in the same sequence. So, once you lay the literatures side by side, once you put the wars of the Jews and the story of Jesus and the Gospels side by side and just start going through the actual stories that these tales are made up of, you get into kind of a rhythm where you can actually see this obvious relationship. One story is echoing the other. And in fact, you can even predict, if you've never read the Gospels, what kind of story will be coming next, because, once you get to the sort of understand the thing, you can say, well, there's got to be a human Passover lamb in Josephus because there's a human Passover lamb here in the Gospels. And in fact, I found a passage in Josephus that is an obvious parallel to the crucifixion story that we have in the Gospels. And it was quite remarkable that I discovered it because it's so obvious, but scholars had never noticed it. And And the reason that I could see it is simply because I knew it was going to be there. I was following along in the story of Jesus Christ as it was predicting the events that this historian was recording. And so I knew there had to be a crucifixion story that, you'd have three of them being crucified and one would have to survive and someone would have to beg the Roman commander to take him off the cross, and so all these elements are in the story of Josephus. And
of course they weren't about Jesus in the story of Josephus, it's about somebody else.
Yeah. The Josephus, the character, Josephus, his name is actually Joseph Bar Matthias, Joseph son of Matthias, and the character in the Gospels is Joseph Arimathea, and it's really, if you look at the Greek, it's just about the same word. So it's an example of kind of typologic connection where they make a pun. They don't use verbatim. That wouldn't be the right genre, but they just make it close enough to the story, close enough to the name in this case, that an alert reader can just see it's obviously a deliberate connection.
Okay. And I think you also mentioned there were some other, similarities in other places, but what I wanted to ask you, was there any similarities between the works of Josephus and the Dead Sea Scrolls as well?
No. Josephus wrote in the Caesar's court. His histories were written after the war, and he'd been adopted by the Flavian Caesars. Actually used their name. He calls himself Flavius Josephus, as though he's an actual member of the imperial family. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are all very xenophobic, very religious and fundamental. But Josephus is writing in the Roman court, and he's completely accepting the Roman way of life and things, so that the Dead Sea Scrolls and Josephus are just miles apart in terms of political perspective. But the same distance is true between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospels. In fact, it's just it shows. In fact, it's very suspicious that the Gospels and Josephus would have such a similar political perspective when they both claim to be, in Josephus' case, he claims to be a Jewish historian. And then in the case of Jesus, he claims to be a Christ, someone was foreseen and had all of these divine connections into the Hebrew lineage, which produces the branch of Jesse, the son of David character who's a Messiah. Well, if you just think about it for a second, who was David? He was a warrior. How in the world would those stories and that lineage of prophecy produce someone like Jesus Christ, who's a pacifist? It just on its face makes no sense. And so, the character Jesus is very suspicious, and frankly, the histories of Josephus, supposedly a Jewish author, are equally suspicious because, in the case of Josephus, everyone simply knows this since he's writing in the Flavian court. But in the case of the character Jesus Christ, people should be suspicious because he has the political perspective of the Flavian court.
Well, the thing that I find very strange also is, to my knowledge, I don't remember anywhere in the Old Testament in any of the prophecies of Jesus that said he would have a political axe to grind, a religious axe to grind, or a spiritual axe to grind, only that he was going to be the savior of mankind. It didn't say anything about in what capacity, unless, of course, you might think of a verse that I'm not thinking of.
Well, everything is interpretation, when you're into prophecy and divine understanding of text, so that, almost everything is permissible in any kind of analysis. But just in a general sense, the stories of the Old Testament are nationalistic, they're xenophobic, they're racial. The Messiah, who is from the lineage of David, is from the lineage of the guy who, killed Goliath and cut off his head. So it just isn't a normal transition from this character to a character who is telling you to turn the other cheek.
Well, yeah, and that's not the only difference from the Old Testament to the New Testament. A lot of people don't seem to realize or notice that all the Old Testament feast days were on the feast days of lunar deities, moon gods. The worship day was, the Sabbath, the lunar day. Everything to do with the New Testament is solar. When did these gods switch from one to the other, and why?
Oh, I wouldn't have a clue about that. The dating, is so complicated that various scholars can't agree about anything in terms of it. There's just many, many different interpretations of how the dating worked. In a book that I'm going to release, I'll give in maybe 6 or 7 months from now, I have an analysis of the different datings of the Passover that the Gospels describe. And this is something that has been very perplexing to scholars. They wonder why the Gospel of John seems to have a different day for the Passover that the Synoptic Gospels does. And in my analysis, I show that actually it doesn't. It's just that we haven't really been reading the text very clearly. But if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can see that they had a system of dating that was very, very, very precise and was an integral part of their religion. And so, that certainly would have been something the authors of the Gospels would have been aware of. And as far as how they wanted to change this to fit Jesus into the Roman religious context, I don't really, I have my opinions, but I kind of keep them to myself about that because it really isn't part of my theory. Okay.
And, now you said, your name of your book is The Caesar's Messiah. Who did you say was the main Caesar that,
well, the son, now the kind of the theological perspective of the Gospels, you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, this bizarre trinity of the Christian religion, which has no parallel in the Hebrew religion, in fact, is almost incomprehensible on any level. But what that comes from is the fact that the people who are producing the literature had 3 Caesars. There was the father was Vespasian, his direct son was Titus, and then they had he had a younger brother named Domitian. And the basic theological lineup in the story of Jesus is you have the Father and the Son of God. And this would have been representing, Vespasian would have been essentially God the Father, and Titus would have been, Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God in the Gospels. And, that was just, that just came directly from their political titles. If you go to Rome today, and you go to the Arch of Titus, you'll see on the arch, there's many of the events that Jesus prophesied. The destruction of Jerusalem is actually represented on the arch. And you'll see that, the 2 Flavian Caesars that conducted the military campaign are referred to as God and the Son of God. And so this was the way the Flavians saw themselves, and it's how the characters in the Gospels were developed to relate to the Flavians.
So it's almost like the Flavians were, in their minds, writing their stories about their own self and their own exploits.
That's exactly what they did do. The victors write history. In the case of the Gospels, they just wrote their history as a prophecy, because prophecy was the literature that they needed to essentially do something about, because it was the prophetic literature that the Jews had that was most propelling them to war, to go to war against the Roman Empire. The Messianic prophecies in the Hebrew religion at that time are simply understood, even by secular historians, to have been the most powerful political force that was driving them to fight against Rome. And so this was why the Flavians went out of their way to create a different form of Judaism and a different kind of Messiah. And people, they think, well, why would the Flavians bother to create a religion, when they'd already defeated the Jews? This is a very common comment that comes up when people come across my theory, and it's just, it's well-meaning, but it just comes from a misunderstanding of the history. The Gospels were probably written after the war, say between like 80 and the year, 96, something like that.
Which would also be about roughly 60, 70 years after or 50 or 60 years after the death of Jesus.
Well, that's what. I'll explain that how they arrive at the dates of his ministry, but just in terms of the general historical lineup, in around 115, you had a rebellion break out in Cyrenia, modern day Libya. And it spread throughout the empire. In the island of Cyprus, Roman historians recorded that the Jews gained a military control and genocided every Gentile on the island, over 250,000 people. They did the same thing in Libya. They gained control and killed everyone. So that rebellion then spilled over into Egypt. And the Jews were victorious. They drove the Roman legions out of Alexandria. There's actually letters that have been found of the Roman magistrates trying to flee down the Nile to get away from them. So this then, the rebellion popped up in Asia Minor. It came to pass in Judea itself. So the entire Roman Empire was at risk, you see. So the Flavians, they certainly would have known that in the year 90, when they were like hammering out this Christian religion, they knew how powerful the Jewish rebellion and the Jewish Messianic movement was. And so this was the political reason to try to create a Christian religion, was to attempt to basically head off this force that they could see coming toward them. In terms of like the dating of Jesus, I mean, you can see that the character is fake just by, kind of looking at the dates of his ministry. Supposedly he's, he dies in 33, and they have a little method inside the Gospels that enables you to calculate this. And he dies in Passover. And he is the human Passover lamb. The authors go way out of the way to make absolutely certain that everyone recognizes that the character is the Passover sacrifice of the new covenant. You have the old covenant of the Hebrew Bible, and now with this human Passover lamb, Jesus Christ, you have the new covenant established. So he dies in Passover 73. And now, in the first cycle, you recall that Moses wandered for 40 years before, you had the change of ownership and the Israelites could take possession of Judea and turn it into Eretz Israel. So you had this 40-year period, which is a classic period of penance and other stuff in the Hebraic religion. Well, the end of the war between the Romans and the Jews that the Flavians fought was 73 Passover. So it was 40 years to the day. So in order to create the character of Jesus Christ, they just basically, back calculated 40 years from the end of the war to date the human Passover sacrifice of the new covenant, so there would be a perfect 40-year cycle. Because again, this is typology. They wanted to mirror the founding of the original covenant between the Israelites and God, and they wanted to create this new covenant, and so that's why they had a mimic of the 40-year cycle, and that's how Jesus' ministry was dated and created.
Okay. Well, yeah, and that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, how much they borrowed and mimicked from different stories in the Bible and why they did it. And I think another reason they did it, I saw personally in Matthew, I want to say it was 2:29. I might be wrong about the exact verse, but the prophecy where, he was called out of Nazareth to fulfill the prophecy that shall say he shall be called a Nazarene. If you go back in the Old Testament, that prophecy's nowhere in there, but it does show that they were trying to use backtracking into the Old Testament to fulfill New Testament prophecy, in other words.
Exactly, and that stuff is just everywhere. They mimic the events in the Hebrew Bible just constantly because they're trying to give their character an authority to show that he is a legitimate Messiah and that people should pay attention to him and take his story seriously. So, to understand what was propelling him, you just have to kind of go back and look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and look at how the way that the people were interpreting Scripture to understand when the Messiah was coming was an integral part of the Jews' religion in this era. And so this was what then they wanted to change. They wanted to, make those interpretations to someone who was peaceful, not these warrior messiahs that the Dead Sea Scrolls were looking for. So that's what happened. And, they borrowed, the literary techniques because these techniques were working against the empire, and so they just decided that they would try to take them and make use of them for their own purposes.
Which makes a lot of sense. Now, wasn't Flavius Josephus also a part of the Flavian family before he actually took on the name through his connection to the Herod family?
Unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot known about Josephus beyond what he gives us. In fact, virtually nothing. He gives his genealogy, and he claims to be from the family of Matthias, which would be basically the Maccabees. He claims to be a priest in the Maccabean lineage, and I think that this is fake. I think that that's just as fake as the character Jesus having the lineage back to the family of David. It's just basically a way to give the character authority, to give him some gravitas, because he's in these messianic lineage, and in Josephus's case, that he was, had an unquestionable stature as a historian because he came from the Jews' royal family. Josephus was known, or at least he claims to have known members of the Roman imperial family before the Flavians. He actually claimed to have been a friend of Nero's wife, and yet somehow, even though he's a friend of the imperial family, when the rebellion breaks out in 66, he becomes the leader of the force in Galilee. And it's there that the Flavians capture him, and he has a miraculous prophecy where he understands that Vespasian is going to become Caesar, and he recognizes that the old covenant is dead, that the covenant between God and the Jews is broken, and that a new covenant is established between God and the Romans. So when Josephus writes this, this is the new covenant that pops up in the Gospels. It's just a different way of looking at it. But that's the character Josephus. Now, many people have tried to look for another author to have created the Josephine histories. They think it may have been a nom de plume. I definitely believe that Josephus was, in fact, primarily fiction. I don't know if there was someone who
who was, had some of the aspects of the character's history. But in general, I think a lot of the claims that Josephus makes about himself are just done to give him a kind of authority. So he's so ingrained into the Jewish culture of the era that there's no way anyone can contest or even question the history that he's writing. But frankly, having studied it for years, I just think of it as literature. I don't think of the Gospels and the histories of Josephus as histories at all. I see them as literature, and I think, as in many good novels, there are historical elements, there are things that are true, but the primary genre is fictional in both cases. I think the events that are described in the war and the events that are described in the Gospels, I have no idea to what extent, either one are based upon anything that's real. I just look at them as fictional literature.
So you're pretty sure that it was the Flavius Caesar family, though, that actually wrote the New Testament and founded Christianity?
Yeah,
they were real historical characters.
You have to be careful because I don't think they wrote all the New Testament. I think that parts of the New Testament probably were being worked on by Trajan and Pliny the Younger, even during, up to like 120, 130. I could easily imagine the aspects of the work would have been changed. And I'm not positive that there wasn't versions of Christianity before the Flavians. I mean, you have something called Q. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's...
Oh, yeah. Actually, okay. I had a copy in my hand once.
Yeah. Well, Q's just this logical construct where they assemble a bunch of the sayings that are using some methodology, and they say, look, this could have been a kind of the precursor literature, and it has a sort of pacifistic character that's described. And I have no idea if this is true, but it's certainly conceivable that the Herod family, who I am certain was involved in the writing of the Gospels and the New Testament, they were dealing with the problems of the Messianic movement for generations. I mean, it didn't just begin in 66. The first out-and-out rebellion occurred in the year 1. And this, in fact, was just a continuation of the struggle that the Herods had with the Messianic family going back to when they took over Judea, 100 years before. So the Herods had this long experience of struggling against the Messianic scriptures and interpretations. And so it's completely possible that they had established a kind of, precursor to Christianity at some point, trying to create an alternative Messianic religion. And that then following the war, when they went to create this new character, Jesus Christ, they might have just reused some of that material. So, to both of your points, the Flavians certainly produced the story of Jesus Christ that's in the Gospels. I think that's completely clear. As far as did they develop the very first Roman pacifistic version of Messianic Judaism? I don't think so. I think I would imagine that would have been tried by the Herods. I don't know if they would have had a fully developed Jesus Christ character. They might have. We don't have any evidence of it. All I can do is conjecture, but it certainly would have been logical for them to have done this. The Roman attempt to control the Jews by controlling their religion goes all the way back, frankly, to Julius Caesar, who attempted to control the high priest. The Jewish religion was always a problem for the Roman Empire from the very beginning until the diaspora in 135. The entire process was just a bloodbath for Rome, and they would have always been, I'm sure, trying to have found ways to have dealt with it politically rather than with expensive wars and violence.
Which I'm sure the Jews never had any problem sacrificing their lives in honor of their God, in other words.
Well, their religion requires it. I mean, you have Samson, saying that he wants to go out and die among the Philistines. So they would have been, if you just look at the description of the Romans following the wars, right? I can just give you a brief example. Following the Bar Kokhba rebellion, 132, 135. The Roman general came back and he didn't give the normal salutation, which was always done when a Roman general returned from a military campaign, which is to come to the city and address Caesar and say, if Caesar is well, I am well, and the troops are well. In this instance, it wasn't given because so many Roman families had lost sons that they were afraid that the salute would have started a rebellion. So I think you can get an understanding of just how violent these rebellions were and what a threat they were to the Roman Empire. And so this was the political backdrop to the forming of the Christian religion, was this existential threat to the empire that the religion represented. Okay.
Now, before I forget to mention this, don't you also have a video out on this here book?
Surely do. If you go to either CaesarsMessiah.com or Inside Out Asylum, which is a website that I discuss both Caesar's Messiah and also the newer books, you can buy a documentary that was directed and produced by Fritz Heed, who worked on The Secret of the Sphinx and The Secret War of Desert Storms, two of my favorite documentaries. And Fritz did a documentary in Caesar's Messiah, and I think it's very good documentary. I'm biased obviously, but I think it does a very good job presenting the theory, and it saves the person the brain damage of trying to work through my prose. It's very entertaining, I think, and gives a reader, or excuse me, a viewer, just a good understanding of the theory and the history very quickly.
Okay. Now, evidently, the Flavians must have had a huge success, because eventually Christianity became the leading religion, the one that actually Constantine, or Teen, however you pronounce it, chose for the Roman Empire in the end. In what was that, AD 325, I want to say?
Well, I mean, Constantine began the process of making it the state religion. I think the first main, what was the council, was 305, I believe, 304, 305. And from then on, it was a 70-year process of making it the state religion. A number of Caesars participated in it. It was a violent process. They basically condemned the other religions and would, level the temples and forbid people from worshiping anything other than Jesus. And so this really is why the religion is even, I think, still with us, because if Constantine had chosen another religion to make the state religion, I don't think we'd even be having a discussion about Christianity. I think it was completely because Constantine made that decision. And, there's been many, many guesses as to why he chose Christianity. His real name was Flavius Constantine.
I was wondering if he was going to get to that.
Yeah, it's Flavius Constantine, and I think he was a family member, even though they didn't record those genealogic connections at that point. But he had connected his divine arch to the arches of Titus and Vespasian when he erected it in Rome outside of the Colosseum. So
that's kind of like admitting he's a member of the family right there.
Exactly. And it's very interesting. One thing that very few people know is that Constantine, when he died, he had the artifacts of the 12 disciples brought to his burial site. and he surrounded himself in a circle so that the 12 disciples are surrounding him. And many people who have looked at this have said, gee, it sure seems like he's saying that he is Jesus Christ, you see. So that to me is completely convincing, and it just shows that...
Or that his family is, maybe?
Yeah, well, the Domitian also claimed, the younger brother of Titus also claimed to be Jesus Christ. To the Flavians, the title of Christ was basically just a title anyone could take on, and all of them would have seen themselves as the Christ. It wouldn't have just been Titus, or it wouldn't have just been their fictional character Jesus. I mean, they were all Jesus Christ, the Savior Messiah. And so when Constantine died, I'm sure he was well aware that eventually Christianity would be understood as, having come from the Flavian family. And so he wanted posterity to be aware that he was in on the joke, and that he too was a Jesus. So this was where the actual historical power of Christianity came from, is from Flavius Constantine, when he made it the state religion, and that's until then. I think after the war, following 135, there really isn't a whole lot of archaeologic evidence of Christianity. It's not like it's a flourishing cult where there's a lot of artifacts being developed. It's there. It's a nascent kind of religion, but after Constantine, it just pops up everywhere because it's the bloody state religion. So that was the decision that gave it its political power, was Constantine's decision to make it the state religion.
Well, for my money, I'm banking that he chose the particular Christianity he did because it was created by his family. I mean, God knows that there was Catharsism, Calvinism, and I think it was Jacobites, Ebionites, all other Gnostic, sects he could have chosen, yet he chose this particular one, and it happened to be from his family line or people that shared his family name. I couldn't agree more. It's great. Like a duck quacks like a duck. It's liable to be a duck.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And it's funny that this is something that so few scholars are wise to, but in fact, it is very suspicious, and obviously it should be the first thing that anyone questions about, well, what was Constantine's purpose? And, the obvious answer is, well, there was a political purpose somehow. Why did he do it? What was the back of all that? And so it's it's just another example of, once you kind of grab onto the Flavian creation of Christianity, the religion just makes a lot more sense.
No, that is true. And you got a lot of people out there are not aware of the fact that Constantine was not only responsible for legalizing his brand of Christianity, but he was also the one that switched everything from the Sabbath to the first day of the week, which was Sunday. And he's also the one that, instituted Easter when he did.
Right. Well, the part of his legacy that I think is the biggest oversight is the fact that he created the feudal system. And this is, I think, shows you what was in his mind, with the creation of Christianity as the state religion. Before Constantine, you had, a whole class of Romans called the coloni. And these were free men who could, colonize or take wild land and turn it into farmland, and then they could own a fraction of the product of the land, and that's where we get the expression colonize from. So the coloni, had basically rights. They had rights to the land. They had rights to sell the product of the land. They could sell the land. When Constantine created the edicts that began Christianity as a state religion, he also issued other edicts that are not so well known. And these edicts established the feudal system. I mean, suddenly The coloni could not own the land. Coloni could not ever leave the land. The coloni could not change vocation, had to take the same job his father did. The coloni's children could be sold. That's not something you'd think a follower of Jesus would, want to promote. But this was something that Constantine put into effect. And so these edicts that Constantine created were the beginning of the feudal system. It bound the serf, and the serf is just another fancy name for slave. It bound the serf to the land, and it took away all of his rights. That system stayed in effect for over 1,000 years.
No way to grow, no way to escape.
Yeah, they completely extinguished the intellectual light of Europe. Before the Dark Ages, and the feudal system was what really onset the Dark Ages. I mean, Rome was on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. They literally had everything, perhaps except the piston and electricity, to have, created Silicon Valley. I mean, they were right on the edge of the Industrial Revolution. And yet 500 years later, they're having trouble making mud huts. What happened? Well, the feudal system happened, and it just took away all incentive and capacity for intellectual development, and put the serf into not just a physical slavery, but a mental slavery. And this really is what Christianity is. And this is one of the really saddest things about my work, is that it shows that Christianity basically, it was a mind control device that the oligarchs created to produce obedient, stupid, docile slaves that would do whatever they wanted them to do, and would just accept the idea that there was some kind of workers' paradise that would occur after they were dead. So this was really what Constantine had in mind. People, they subtract the edicts that created the feudal system that Constantine produced from the edict that created Christianity as the state religion. And Constantine gets this very positive legacy for purportedly bringing us out of paganism into this modern world of Christianity. But this is ridiculous. Basically, what he did is he took us back to a primitive condition that without any mental capacity, and he used Christianity as a way to just dull the minds of the European. And frankly, I think we've never recovered. I think that
I was about to say, it's still dulling people's minds to this day.
It still is, and the effects are with us everywhere. And so this is really one of the reasons why I do promote my work. Why I brought it out is because I thought that this is really valuable information. I mean, this is something that I think young people should know, and it's a way of understanding government. You can see government in a much more suspicious light. You can be a lot more energetic about trying to keep an open democracy when you have a little paranoia created by realizing that the governments use these kinds of mind control devices to enslave us. So
which is also more the reason to vote more Democrat and less Republican.
Well, unfortunately, from my perspective, what I see is just false flags everywhere. I mean, I see Christianity as a false flag religion, and so the dialectic, the struggle that it describes, is false. And I think that the oligarchs are smart enough to know that to have any power, you have to control both sides of the political struggle, but you have to make the people believe that there is a struggle going on. So for my money, I'm suspicious of both parties, and I look to try to understand, who is controlling both of them, not just how one fights against the other.
Which, in all honesty, there's been I think money's the biggest controlling factor, but the question is, who's got the money that's paying it out?
Right, exactly. I think that in my mind, the whole Federal Reserve System is just a kind of Christianity that is just basically a mind control device that is that has no real basis in fact. It's just people believe certain things which are untrue, and so this would be to get democracy really animated and moving in a good direction, a direction protecting us. We would want to analyze that situation very carefully to try to, find out how we could improve upon it. Right.
Okay, then, are there any last minute thoughts or anything you'd like to share that I didn't mention or anything?
I think we gave a pretty good look at it. I would just say that, you can go to CaesarsMessiah.com. I'm always available to answer questions. The book's there, the documentary's there. I have a new book out, which is called Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. And it shows the relationship between the Shakespearean literature and the Gospels and the New Testament that has been overlooked. It shows who actually wrote the material and why. And it actually shows that the author of Shakespeare agreed with me that the Flavians produced
that sounds like something I'd want to read.
Well, I hope you do. And love to.
Would the person who wrote Shakespeare by any chance?
Pardon me?
The person who wrote Shakespeare, if you'll pardon my interruption,
yes.
I don't want to let you get away without me asking this, though.
Sure.
Would that by any chance be Sir Francis Bacon?
No. Oddly enough, Shakespeare, the literature of we call Shakespeare, was written by a woman. Her name was Amelia Bassano. She was a language tutor. She was dark-skinned and a very interesting character. Just to give you, Shakespeare is a false flag literature. She was from a Jewish family and knew about the Gospels, had a terrible experience with the Christian authorities, and so the literature is really the Shakespearean literature is really a kind of a tit for tat. In other words, to the extent that the Flavians produced a fake Jewish literature with fake Jewish authors like, Matthew and Mark. So she produced a fake Gentile literature, and even her name, Shakespeare, is a pun. I mean, Will Shakespeare is just a martial declaration that we haven't been destroyed by the Catholic faith, and we are still fighting. So just to real quickly give you a little bonbon of what people don't see when they look at the literature, in Titus Andronicus, which is just an obvious spoof of Titus Flavius, there are many connections to the Flavians that have been just totally overlooked. For example, if you read it, you'll see that in one point someone says, "What is your brother doing, Titus?" And Titus says, "He's by himself killing flies." And the guy says, "Well, why is he killing flies?" And Titus says, "That's what he does. He kills flies." And he goes, "Well, it doesn't become the brother of Titus to kill flies." Well, classically trained scholars will know that the brother of Titus Flavius, Domitian, was famous for killing flies. That was his favorite thing to do. So you can see that the author is clearly making some comment on the Flavians that hasn't been understood. But then if you go on in Titus Andronicus, you'll see that you have a Last Supper and cannibalism, and the jokes that I show that come to pass against the Jews in the Gospels in the Shakespeare literature are coming to pass against the Gentiles. So it's a reversal of the mockery that the Romans produced with their Gospels.
Sounds very interesting, I tell you. I'm going to look up that and do a little research on it.
Oh, thank you. I hope it is interesting to you. And if you ever have any questions or like me to come on and talk about it, I'm happy to do that, Royce.
Actually, I was going to tell you that I might just contact you in the near future to come on to Revolution Radio and maybe share a little bit over there, since you already know there's a bigger live audience.
I very much enjoy the people there and talking to you. And if there's ever, you ever would like to have me come by and chat, I promise I'll be available.
Okay, well, thanks so much. I'm going to call back because I'm expecting my wife.
Okay. Well, hey, it was good talking to you, buddy, and I'll talk to you soon, okay?
Okay.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Guys, I want to thank you guys for listening in. It's been an enjoyable evening. And I want to remind y'all to join me tomorrow at freedomslips.com at Revolution Radio. I'm going to be interviewing Jay Gallus, and it's going to be about his book, Peace, O Christ. It's got some similar information to tonight's guest, only from a different angle and a different perspective. Same story, a different side of it, I guess you might say. A lot of new information. I think y'all enjoy it, so join us tomorrow. With that, I want to thank you for listening in. Really enjoyed y'all being here. And y'all have a good night, and I'm going to call it quits. About what got you interested in Caesar's Messiah?
Sure. Well, I had studied the Gospels when I was a young boy. I grew up in Japan. I attended a Jesuit, what was called a military academy. I'm not sure why they called it that, but it was a school that studied the Gospels essentially every day. It was a boarding school, and we would just pay attention to the Gospels and try to understand it as best we could. But later in life, I sort of just fell away from the faith. I didn't have any negative experiences. I just sort of got into other things, and it just wasn't something, Christianity just wasn't something that was that important to me at a certain point. And but I always was very curious about the character Jesus for some reason. And I think probably somewhere in college I started to become interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what really interested me and what really kind of set me to broaden my research and to have it be in a more focused nature was the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I started reading writers and scholars that had alternative explanations. For example, Robert Eisenman, he wrote a book called James, the Brother of Jesus, and he was very much linking the Gospels into the war. He was showing all of these kinds of connections between the story of Jesus and this war. And so, this then, in general, led me back to start just beginning to study the Gospels in a very focused way, and particularly in their relationship to the war. And so, in order to study the war, and in fact, to study the history of Judea at all, you have to read a historian called Flavius Josephus. Josephus is just the only extant historian that we have. There's just nobody else that left any material about Judea in the first century who was on the ground. So I started studying him, and while doing that, I saw that there were strange connections and relationships between the war that Josephus was described a messianic movement. It was a group that basically looked to a Christ or Messiah and had basically the same proof texts. In other words, they looked at the same scripture passages that the authors of the Gospels used in relationship to prefiguration of Jesus. But this group looked to a different individual. This group was militaristic. And the literature was clearly part of the literature that propelled the Jews to rebel and had the Great War with Rome between 66 and 73 CE. So it was curious to me how, in the Gospels you would have kind of a quasi-pacifist character, Messiah. At the same time, another messianic organization was in Judea that was completely militaristic. So just studying the two organizations side by side, it just made no sense to me how they could have coexisted. And I just began then to try to understand the Gospels in a different way. And
for authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs, listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And joining me today is going to be Joseph Atwill, and he's the author of Caesar's Messiah. And we're going to be talking about his book today. He has some information about it he'd like to share and see what you folks think. And if y'all want to learn more about him, his website's www.caesarsmessiah.com. Feel free to pay him a visit, and he'll have other links to other interesting information as well. And if y'all want to call in and ask questions, the number is 832-632-7904. And before we get started, I always like to remind everybody that Talk Now Radio is listener-supported radio. With y'all's help, I don't have to, worry about having sponsors fund me that may or may cancel out the first time I have a topic that they don't like. I can pretty well guarantee folks out there tonight that if I was being sponsored by, say, Chick-fil-A, the Tonight Show would probably not go aired because of funding. Because I think everybody knows that they're Christians, and anybody that says anything different than the Bible about the Messiah is liable to have problems from any Christian source of funding. So when you guys do the donation meter, click on the affiliate links and things of that nature, you're basically helping me stay listening supported and keep the information coming to you that otherwise may not get to you. So how are you doing today, Joseph?
just fine, Royce. Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the air. And I got to tell you, I've really been blessed this week because I got you lined up for today on Caesar's Messiah. And I got Jay Gallus lined up tomorrow over at Revolution Radio for Pico Christ. So I'm getting to do two really good subjects. Well, your subjects are actually very close, but not exactly the same in a 2-day time span. So I feel lucky. So why don't you tell us a little something just to break the ice with the listeners?